The first thing I noticed wasn't the applause. It was Warren's hand on my shoulder, heavy, almost possessive, while the entire executive floor clapped like we'd just won a championship. Blue and silver balloons were bouncing against the ceiling vents, and someone had cut into a giant cake that said 500% growth in thick blue icing. 18 months of 12-hour days, late-night strategy calls, and every client meeting I could squeeze into a calendar. For a few seconds, I honestly believed this celebration was for me. Then Warren lifted his glass and said something that made the room feel suddenly smaller. "Before we go any further," he said, smiling, "I want everyone to meet the person who will be leading this department from now on." The door opened behind me, and the man walking in was half my age. The cake was still sitting in the break room refrigerator the next morning. Someone had wrapped the leftover slices in plastic, and when I opened the door to grab a bottle of water, the sweet smell of frosting drifted out. For a second, I just stood there looking at it. Blue icing, perfect lettering, 500% growth. My team's work, my work, and now, apparently, the foundation for someone else's promotion. The office felt strange that week. Not hostile exactly, just careful. People spoke a little quieter when I walked into meetings. A few of my team members kept giving me those quick glances that said, "Are you okay?" without actually asking the question. I answered emails. I joined client calls. I reviewed campaign dashboards with the same routine I'd followed for 3 years. Outwardly, nothing had changed, except that now Gavin Hallbrook had the corner office. On Monday afternoon, Warren asked me to stop by his office. The door was half open, and I could hear the faint tapping of a keyboard inside. "Cheryl," he said when I stepped in, leaning back in his chair like the celebration the day before had been the most natural thing in the world. "I want you to help Gavin get up to speed." "Of course you do," I thought. Out loud, I said, "What specifically do you want him to focus on first, clients?" Warren said immediately. "Your relationships are the backbone of this department. If Gavin understands how you've built those connections, the transition will be seamless." Seamless. That word stuck in my head the rest of the day. The next morning, Gavin appeared at my office around 10. No knock, just a light tap on the doorframe. "You've got a minute?" he asked. He was dressed like someone who had spent a lot of money learning how executives are supposed to look. Crisp shirt, expensive watch, hair cut so precisely it almost looked sculpted. I pulled up a chair beside my desk. "Let's start with the client portfolio," I said. For the next hour, I walked him through our largest accounts. Who handled what? Which companies preferred weekly updates versus monthly reporting? Which marketing channels performed best for different industries? Gavin nodded politely, took a few notes, but something about the conversation felt off. Every time I explained how a campaign strategy worked, he seemed only half interested. His eyes drifted toward the window, or his phone, or the framed awards on my bookshelf. But the moment I mentioned client relationships, his attention snapped back. "How long have you worked with Caldwell Manufacturing?" he asked. "About 4 years," I said. "And the CEO trusts you personally?" "Yes." He leaned forward slightly. Do most of the big clients feel that way? That question lingered in the air longer than it should have. Later that afternoon, I opened one of the quarterly performance summaries to prepare for a client call, and that was when I noticed something small. The numbers on the internal executive report were slightly different from the campaign data my team had produced. Not dramatically different, just enough to make the results look stronger. At first, I thought it was a formatting error, but the longer I stared at the report, the more something about it started to bother me. At first, I assumed it was a formatting issue. That happens more often than people realize. Different reporting templates, slight rounding differences between analytics platforms, someone copying numbers into the wrong column, nothing unusual. So I pulled up the raw dashboard my team used to track campaign performance. The numbers were exactly what I expected. Then I opened the internal executive report again and compared them side by side. That was when the small differences started adding up. A campaign that had delivered a 4.2% conversion rate suddenly appeared as 5.1% in the executive summary. Another client's engagement metrics were bumped just enough to cross a performance benchmark we'd promised during contract negotiations. Individually, none of it looked outrageous, but together. The pattern was uncomfortable. The numbers were being adjusted just enough to make every major account look consistently stronger than it actually was. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen for a while, listening to the low murmur of voices coming from the hallway outside my office. Someone laughed near the coffee machine. A chair rolled across the floor somewhere down the corridor. Normal office sounds. But the spreadsheet in front of me didn't feel normal anymore. I started digging through older reports, quarterly summaries, client presentations, archived campaign analyses. At first, the discrepancies were small, sometimes barely noticeable, but the further back I went, the more obvious the pattern became. About 18 months earlier, right around the time our department started showing aggressive growth during the recession, the reporting format had quietly changed. Not the raw data, just the summaries. I opened one of the original performance exports from our analytics system and compared it to the client presentation that had been sent out the same week. The difference was subtle, but it was definitely there, and the name on the email that forwarded the revised version to the client, Warren Halbrook. I remember staring at that email for a long moment, trying to decide whether I was misunderstanding something, because the adjustment itself wasn't huge. It wasn't like someone had invented numbers out of thin air. The campaigns were performing well, just not quite as well as the report suggested, which raised a question I couldn't ignore. Why would Warren need to polish the results if the campaigns were already strong? That thought sat in the back of my mind the rest of the afternoon. Around 3 o'clock, I walked down to the analytics team's area. Nadia Brooks was sitting at her desk surrounded by 3 monitors, scrolling through performance charts. "Quick question," I said. She swiveled her chair toward me. "What's up? Have we changed the way campaign summaries are calculated recently?" I asked. "Anything with reporting thresholds or conversion projections?" Nadia frowned slightly and shook her head. "No. The raw exports are the same as always." Why? I hesitated for a second, just checking something. On my way back to my office, I passed Gavin talking with 2 members of the sales team near the glass conference room. He stopped me with a quick gesture. "Hey, Cheryl." "1 second." I walked over. "Just curious," he said casually. "How stable are our long-term clients during economic downturns?" "Depends on the relationship," I said. "And Caldwell?" he asked. "What about them?" Gavin shrugged. "My dad mentioned they represent a pretty big chunk of our revenue." "They do," I said. He nodded slowly. "Good to know." The conversation ended there, but the timing bothered me. Because Caldwell Manufacturing was exactly one of the clients whose performance numbers had been adjusted in the executive reports. When I got back to my office, I reopened the spreadsheet and looked again at the column where the revised numbers appeared. The adjustments weren't random. They all happened in accounts tied to our largest clients. And suddenly, the celebration from the day before felt different, because if those clients ever compared their campaign results with independent market data, this entire success story Warren had been celebrating might not hold together nearly as well as everyone in that room believed. 2 days later, I had a lunch scheduled with Ronald Caldwell. It wasn't unusual. Caldwell Manufacturing had been with our firm longer than I'd worked there. Every couple of months we met in person to review campaigns and talk about whatever direction their marketing strategy might take next. The restaurant Ronald preferred sat 3 blocks from our office, a quiet place with dark wood tables and tall windows facing the street. When I walked in, the host pointed me toward a booth near the back where Ronald was already sitting. He stood up when he saw me. "Cheryl," he said, shaking my hand. "Good to see you." "You too," I said, sliding into the seat across from him. A server came by, and Ronald ordered iced tea. I asked for the same. For a few minutes, we talked about ordinary things, shipping delays, the slow recovery in manufacturing orders, the way marketing budgets had tightened across the industry. It all felt normal, but something about Ronald's tone was slightly more reserved than usual. When the drinks arrived, he stirred the ice in his glass slowly and looked at me for a moment. "Before we get into the campaign updates," he said, "I've been meaning to ask you something." "Sure," I said. Our analytics team has been comparing the performance reports your firm sends us with some external market data. My fingers paused around the condensation on the outside of my glass. And I asked. Ronald leaned back slightly. The numbers don't line up exactly. He didn't sound angry. If anything, he sounded curious. We've noticed the same pattern across several quarters, he continued. Your reports show stronger conversion performance than what independent industry benchmarks suggest. I watched the traffic moving slowly past the restaurant window while he spoke. Cars rolling through the intersection. A delivery truck backing into a loading zone. For a moment I thought about giving the standard answer, the one every agency executive uses when a client questions data. Something about attribution models, variations in tracking methodology, differences between platform analytics, but Ronald had worked with me too long for that kind of explanation. Instead, I said something else. The campaign data generated by my team matches the analytics dashboards we manage internally. Ronald nodded once. And the reports we receive? He asked. They go through an executive review process before being sent out. He studied my face carefully. You're saying those numbers might be adjusted after your team submits them. I'm saying, I replied slowly, that the summaries you receive are not always identical to the original campaign exports. Ronald didn't say anything for a few seconds. He simply tapped his finger lightly against the side of the glass. You know, he said eventually, my finance director started asking questions about this last quarter. That surprised me. Really? He nodded. We ran an independent analysis of our own digital traffic patterns. Your team's campaign strategy lines up with what we're seeing on our side. The engagement trends make sense, but the performance summaries look cleaner. Cleaner. That was exactly the word I'd been thinking about. The numbers weren't fake, they were polished. Ronald leaned forward slightly. Help me understand something. Cheryl, he said, is this a reporting issue or a management issue? I took a sip of the iced tea and set the glass down again. I can only speak for the data my team produces. That was the most honest answer I could give without accusing anyone directly. Ronald nodded again. Slowly this time. I appreciate that. The server returned with our food, but the conversation had already shifted. We talked about future campaign plans for a few minutes, but the earlier question hung quietly between us. Finally, Ronald folded his napkin and set it beside his plate. I think we're going to review our contract with your firm over the next few weeks, he said. He wasn't threatening. He sounded like someone making a business decision. I understand, I said. As we stood to leave, Ronald shook my hand again. You've always been straight with us. Cheryl, he said, that's one of the reasons we stayed with your agency through the recession. He paused for a moment before adding one more thing. Just out of curiosity, does your new vice president know about these reporting discrepancies? I thought about Gavin standing in my office asking questions about which clients trusted me personally. Then I shook my head. I don't think he knows very much about the reporting structure yet. Ronald gave a small, thoughtful nod. Well, he said, reaching for the door, I suppose we'll all be learning quite a bit more soon. The office felt normal the next morning. That was the strange part. People were still walking in with coffee cups and laptops tucked under their arms. Someone in the design department had music playing softly through their speakers. The receptionist was laughing with a delivery driver near the front desk. If you didn't know what had been said over lunch the day before, you would think nothing had changed. But something had, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough that I could feel it in the rhythm of the day. Around 10 o'clock, my phone buzzed while I was reviewing campaign dashboards. The caller ID showed Caldwell Manufacturing. I answered. Cheryl speaking. Hey, Cheryl. It's Melissa from Caldwell's operations team, the voice said. I recognized her immediately. We'd worked together on quarterly reporting calls for years. Hey, Melissa, I said. What's going on? There was a brief pause on the other end. We're updating some internal projections, she said carefully. Our finance department asked if you could send the raw campaign exports for the last 2 quarters. Raw exports, not the summaries. I leaned back slightly in my chair and watched a group from the sales team walk past my office door. Sure, I said. I can send those over. Thanks, she said quickly. Just the direct analytics outputs. No formatted reports. Understood. We hung up. For a few seconds, I sat there with the phone still in my hand. That call told me two things. First, Caldwell wasn't waiting weeks to review the contract like Ronald had suggested at lunch. They were already verifying the data. Second, they wanted the numbers before Warren's office could touch them. Later that afternoon, Gavin appeared at my doorway again. He had a tablet under his arm this time and looked unusually focused. "Quick question," he said. "Go ahead." "I've been reviewing the client structure," he said. "My dad thinks it might make sense for me to start leading some of the bigger accounts directly." I nodded slowly. Which ones? He glanced down at the screen. Caldwell Manufacturing. Obviously. And maybe 2 or 3 others. "Why Caldwell first?" I asked. He shrugged. "They're one of our oldest partners. My dad thinks it would send a good signal." A good signal. The phrase sat in my mind for a moment. "What kind of signal?" I asked. "That the company is moving forward," Gavin said. "Fresh leadership, new strategy." I studied his face while he spoke. He wasn't lying. He simply had no idea what was happening. "Caldwell usually prefers stability," I said. "They've worked with the same contact person for years." "Well," Gavin said, giving a small, confident smile. "That's about to change." He walked away before I had time to respond. I turned back to my laptop. The email from Caldwell's operations team was already in my inbox. The request was simple. Campaign exports. Last 2 quarters. No executive summaries. I opened the analytics platform and generated the files before attaching them to the reply. I paused for a moment and reread the numbers. They matched exactly what my team had tracked. Solid performance. Nothing inflated. Just honest campaign data. Then I hit send. The next 2 days were quiet. Too quiet. By Thursday morning, another message appeared in my inbox, this one from a different client. They were asking for clarification about reporting metrics used in the previous quarter. An hour later, the sales director walked past my office with a worried look I hadn't seen before. And by late afternoon, Warren called an unscheduled leadership meeting. When I walked into the conference room, the atmosphere felt different from the celebration earlier that week. No balloons, no cake, just a long table, a stack of printed reports, and Warren standing at the head of the room with both hands resting flat on the surface. He looked calm, but the muscles in his jaw were tight. "We've received a few questions from clients about recent campaign reports," he said. His eyes briefly landed on me before moving around the room. "Nothing serious," he added quickly. "Just routine clarification." Routine? The word sounded strangely fragile. Because by that point, I already knew something Warren didn't. The questions weren't stopping. They were spreading. The leadership meeting ended faster than most people expected. Warren spoke for about 15 minutes, flipping through the printed reports on the table while explaining that some clients had questions about reporting methodology. His voice stayed calm, controlled, the way executives talk when they want everyone in the room to believe a situation is manageable. He used phrases like alignment and clarification. No one challenged him, but the atmosphere in that conference room had shifted. You could feel it in the way people avoided eye contact with each other while gathering their laptops. When the meeting ended, everyone filed out quietly. "Except Warren, Cheryl," he said, stopping me before I reached the door. A moment. The room was empty except for the 2 of us. Sunlight from the glass wall cut across the conference table, illuminating the stack of reports he had brought in. "You've been in contact with Caldwell this week," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I replied. "What exactly did they ask you for raw campaign exports?" I said. "Their finance team is reviewing projections." Warren stared at me for a second longer than usual. "Did you send them?" "Yes." Another pause. "You should have routed that request through my office first." "I didn't think that was necessary," I said. "They asked for the same analytics exports we generate internally." The muscles in his jaw tightened slightly. "That's not the point." But he didn't elaborate. Instead, he gathered the papers on the table into a neat stack. "We'll handle client communication centrally from now on," he said, "until these reporting questions settle down." The phrase "settle down" sounded less confident this time. I nodded once. "Understood." When I stepped back into the hallway, the office felt different again. Not loud, not chaotic, just unsettled. Over the next week, the questions kept coming. At first, they arrived as polite emails asking for clarification about certain campaign metrics. Then, the requests became more formal. Several clients asked for detailed performance breakdowns across multiple quarters. A few wanted direct access to the analytics dashboards rather than summarized reports. Every request meant the same thing. They were verifying the numbers. Sales meetings started running longer. People from finance were suddenly involved in marketing discussions that had never required their attention before. And one afternoon, I walked past the glass boardroom and saw two outside consultants sitting with Warren and the company's legal counsel, compliance advisors. That was the moment the situation stopped feeling like a temporary problem. Because when lawyers and compliance teams appear, it means someone higher up has decided the issue could become bigger than a few confused clients. 3 weeks after my lunch with Ronald Caldwell, the board of directors announced an internal audit. The message went out company-wide in a short email from the COO. It described the audit as a routine review of reporting processes, but the word routine didn't fool anyone, especially not the employees who had been watching the client calls, the tense leadership meetings, and the sudden arrival of outside consultants. Meanwhile, Gavin stopped dropping by my office. Most days I saw him moving quickly between meetings with Warren and the legal team, his tablet tucked tightly against his chest. The confident smile he had worn the week of the celebration had disappeared. One Friday afternoon, he passed my desk without noticing me at first. When he did, he paused awkwardly. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I replied. For a moment, it looked like he wanted to say something else. Instead, he nodded and kept walking. Later that evening, I sat alone in my office finishing a campaign report for another client. Outside my window, traffic crawled slowly through the downtown streets as the sun started to set behind the buildings. I thought about the balloons from the celebration 2 weeks earlier, about the cake, about the speech, and I realized something I hadn't fully understood at the time. Warren hadn't just been celebrating the company's growth that day. He had been celebrating the story he believed he could control. What he hadn't realized was that stories built on polished numbers tend to fall apart the moment too many people start asking the same question. About 2 months after the internal audit started, I handed in my resignation. There wasn't a dramatic confrontation, no shouting in a conference room, just a short meeting with HR, a few signatures, and a quiet walk back to my office to pack up the things I actually owned. A framed photo from my first industry conference, a notebook filled with client strategy ideas, the ceramic coffee mug my team had given me the year we broke our first major revenue milestone. Outside the window, the city looked exactly the same as it had the day of the celebration. But the company didn't. The audit kept expanding. Clients paused contracts while they waited for explanations. Some of the executives who had clapped the loudest at that celebration suddenly stopped speaking so confidently in meetings. A few weeks after I left, Ronald Caldwell called. Not to ask about Warren's company. He wanted to know if I was planning to start consulting independently. I told him I was thinking about it. These days, that small consulting firm has turned into something bigger than I expected. And sometimes I still think back to that room with the balloons and the cake, because losing the promotion that day felt like the worst thing that could happen to my career. It turns out it was the moment that forced me to build something that actually belonged to me. If you've ever watched someone take credit for work you built, I'd really like to hear how you handled it. Share your story in the comments, and subscribe if you want to hear what happened next in my world.